The ring didn't fit. It had been her grandmother's, resized twice already for two different brides who weren't her. And still it sat loose on Margaret's finger, turning when she didn't want it to, catching the light when she wished it wouldn't. She had stopped trying to keep it still by the second week of her marriage. The house wasn't hers either, not really. Tall and gray-stoned on the edge of Halifax Harbor, full of furniture chosen by a dead woman, whose portrait still hung in the front hall, watching everyone who came and went, with the same flat, unimpressed eyes Margaret had inherited her husband's silence from. Nathaniel Pryce had married her in March, in a ceremony arranged over letters and lawyers, and the kind of dinners where both families discussed shipping contracts, more than they discussed the two people being joined. He was 31. She was 24. They had spoken perhaps 6 times before the wedding, and 4 of those conversations had been about the weather. It was not unhappy, exactly. Margaret was careful with that word, turned it over before she let herself use it even in her own head. Unhappy implied something had gone wrong, some specific injury she could name and point to and eventually heal from. What she had instead was quieter than that. A marriage conducted at arm's length, 2 people orbiting the same rooms without ever quite occupying them together. Nathaniel was polite. He was, by every external measure, a good man. He didn't raise his voice, didn't drink past sense, didn't humiliate her in front of the staff. He simply wasn't there, even when he was standing 6 feet away from her at the breakfast table, reading correspondence from his shipping offices with an attention he had never once turned toward her. She had told herself, in the beginning, that this was simply how marriages like hers worked. Her mother had said as much, the night before the wedding, sitting on the edge of Margaret's bed, with her hands folded the way she folded them at church. Love is something that happens later, if it happens at all. Affection grows where you plant it and water it faithfully. Margaret had nodded, because there was nothing else to do with that sentence, except nod, and she had carried it with her into the marriage like a coat she didn't quite believe would keep her warm, but wore anyway because everyone said it would. 8 months in, she still hadn't found the warmth. What she had found instead was Eli. It started so unremarkably that afterward, trying to locate the moment it became something, Margaret could never find a single hinge point. He was Nathaniel's shipping clerk, the youngest son of a fisherman from Lunenburg, who had worked his way into the Pryce offices through sheer persistence and a head for numbers that even Nathaniel grudgingly respected. He came to the house twice a month with ledgers that needed Nathaniel's signature, and on the occasions Nathaniel was delayed at the docks. He waited in the front parlor, and Margaret, who had nothing else to do with her afternoons except needlework she didn't love, and letters she didn't want to write, would sit with him. He talked to her like she had thoughts worth hearing. That was the whole of it, really, when she tried to explain it to herself later. He asked her what she was reading, and then actually listened to the answer. He disagreed with her once, gently, about a novel she'd praised too quickly, and she had gone home that night. She was already home, she lived there, but it had felt like going home, turning the disagreement over in her mind like a coin she kept finding new sides to. It was nothing. It was nothing for months, and then it wasn't. By the 6th month of knowing him, Margaret had started arranging her schedule, faintly, almost without admitting to herself she was doing it, around the days the ledgers were due. She told herself it was simple loneliness finding the nearest available comfort, the way a person left alone in a cold room moves toward whatever fire is lit, regardless of whose fire it is. She told herself a great many things. None of them stopped her from noticing the particular quality of quiet that settled over the parlor when Eli was in it. A quiet that didn't feel like absence the way the rest of the house did. She had not done anything. She held on to that distinction with both hands, the way a person holds the railing of a ship in rough water. She had not done anything beyond sitting across from a man and feeling, for the length of an afternoon, like a person instead of an arrangement. Nathaniel noticed nothing, or said nothing, which in the early days she could not tell apart. The scandal that broke the household open did not belong to Margaret at all. It belonged to her sister. Abigail had always been the favored one, 3 years younger, lighter in temperament, the kind of pretty that made rooms rearrange themselves around her, without her having to ask. Where Margaret had been raised to be useful, Abigail had been raised to be adored, and their mother had never seen the unfairness in that distinction, had in fact seemed to believe it was simply how daughters ought to be sorted, the practical one and the cherished one. As though a family could only afford to dote on a single child, and had chosen wisely in choosing Abigail. So when Abigail's engagement to Dr. Reed collapsed in late autumn, collapsed loudly, publicly, in a manner that involved a broken window, a letter that should never have been sent, and a young man named Samuel Whitfield, whom Abigail had been meeting in secret for the better part of a year. It was Margaret their mother summoned, not Abigail, to manage the wreckage. "You're married now," her mother said, as though marriage conferred some specific competency in disaster. "You have standing in a way Abigail no longer does. Dr. Reed's mother will receive an apology better from you than from her." "An apology for what precisely?" Margaret asked. "Abigail is the one who—" "It does not matter who did what," her mother said, in the voice she used when a conversation was already over. "It matters what is said and to whom and how it is received. Abigail cannot be trusted to say the right thing. She never has been able to. You can." Margaret went, because going was easier than the argument that not going would have required, and because some old, tired part of her recognized the shape of this exactly, recognized that she had spent her whole life being the daughter sent to clean up what someone else had broken. Recognized it, the way you recognize a scar you've had so long you've stopped feeling it. Except that this time, riding in the carriage toward the Reed townhouse, with her mother's instructions sitting like stones in her chest, she did feel it, sharply. She found Dr. Reed's mother in a sitting room that smelled of dried lavender and old grievance, a woman whose face had arranged itself into permanent disappointment long before Margaret arrived to deserve any portion of it. "My sister asked me to convey," Margaret began. "Your sister," said Mrs. Reed, "asked you to convey nothing. Your mother sent you because your sister is a coward, and you, Mrs. Pryce, have always been the one who cleans." It should have stung. It did sting, in the old practiced way Margaret had grown almost fond of, the way you grow fond of an injury that at least confirms you still feel things. But underneath the sting was something else, something that surprised her by arriving at all. Anger, hot and sudden, not at Mrs. Reed but at every single person who had decided, all her life, without ever once consulting her, that cleaning up was simply what Margaret was for. "I won't apologize for her," Margaret said. The words came out before she had finished deciding to say them. "I'll tell you the truth, if you want it, but I won't stand here and apologize on behalf of a woman who isn't even ashamed of what she did." Mrs. Reed's eyebrows rose fractionally. "And what is the truth, Mrs. Pryce?" "The truth is that my sister never loved your son. And she let the engagement run for a year longer than she should have, because it was convenient, and when she found someone she actually wanted, she didn't have the courage to end things honestly. She humiliated him because honesty would have required admitting out loud that she'd wasted his time. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened. I'm sorry for your son's sake. I'm not sorry on my sister's behalf, because she isn't here to be sorry, and I won't pretend to feel something she doesn't." There was a long silence. Then, unexpectedly, something in Mrs. Reed's face loosened. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of grim respect. "That," she said, "is the first honest thing anyone in your family has said to me in 4 months." The visit to the Reeds should have ended there. It didn't, because nothing in Margaret's life seemed capable of staying contained to its original purpose anymore. Dr. Reed himself, Thomas, the discarded fiancé, a physician with tired eyes, and the particular gentleness of a man who has recently had his future rearranged without his consent, was in the house when Margaret arrived, and stayed in the doorway through the whole exchange, unannounced and unacknowledged by his mother until it was over. "You didn't have to do that," he said, once Mrs. Reed had gone to compose herself. "Defend me to my own mother. You could have just said what you were told to say and left. I'm tired of saying what I'm told to say." It came out flatter and more honest than Margaret meant it to. "I apologize. That's not your concern." "It's a little bit my concern," Thomas said. "Given that I've spent 4 months being told by everyone, I know that I was a fool for not seeing it coming, and you're the first person who said, plainly, that it wasn't my fault to begin with." She looked at him properly then, not as Abigail's discarded fiancé, a piece of scenery in someone else's scandal, but as a person standing in front of her with his own particular tiredness, his own particular wound. There was something in the directness of his attention that unsettled her. Not because it was improper, but because it was the same thing she had found in Eli, the same plain fact of being seen, and she did not know what to do with the unsettling realization that she might be a woman who simply hungered for that, regardless of which man happened to be offering it. "I should go," she said. "Of course." He didn't move to stop her, but at the door he said, "If you ever find yourself in want of an honest conversation, Mrs. Pryce, my offices are on Granville Street. I find I have very few honest conversations these days, and I suspect, from the last quarter hour, that you don't either." She didn't answer. She went home and didn't think about it, which was its own kind of lie, because she thought about almost nothing else for 3 days. The unraveling, when it came, came from Nathaniel, and it came from the direction Margaret least expected. She had assumed, if she was ever caught at anything, it would be caught at the thing with Eli. The quiet afternoons, the lingering, the particular care she'd begun taking with her appearance on ledger days, that she told herself was simply and knew was not. She had braced herself for that conversation for months, had rehearsed denials she was ashamed of rehearsing. Instead, it was a letter from Mrs. Reed, of all people, addressed to Nathaniel, thanking him for the courage of his wife, that brought everything into the open. He read it at breakfast. He set it down without expression, which Margaret had learned, over 8 months, was not the same as no expression. It was a held one, a contained one, the particular stillness Nathaniel adopted right before saying something that mattered. "You went to the Reeds," he said. "My mother sent me, and you told them the truth instead of the apology you were instructed to deliver." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over with 2 fingers, and Margaret braced for the rebuke, for the lecture about family loyalty, about the Pryce name, about the inconvenience she had caused. "Good," he said instead. She blinked. "Good? I have spent 8 months," Nathaniel said slowly, as though the words cost him something to assemble, "watching you say what you think people want to hear, and wondering whether there was anyone underneath it, or whether I had married a very well-mannered silence. This is the first time I've seen you choose honesty when it cost you something. I'd like to see it again." It was, Margaret realized with something close to vertigo, the most personal thing he had said to her since their wedding. "Why does it matter to you?" she said carefully. "What I say to the Reeds." Nathaniel set down his coffee. The held stillness in his face cracked, just slightly, into something rawer. "Because I married a stranger on the understanding that affection might come later, the way your mother promised, the way mine promised when she arranged it. And I have spent 8 months waiting for some sign of who you actually are, underneath the manners, and you have given me almost nothing, Margaret. And I told myself that was simply your nature, reserved, careful. And then I read this letter, and I think perhaps it was never your nature. I think perhaps it was mine. I think I gave you nothing to be honest toward." The room felt very small, suddenly, and very loud with things neither of them had said in 8 months. "There's something else," Margaret said, because the honesty Nathaniel had just praised her for seemed to demand its own continuation, however much it frightened her to offer it. "Something I should tell you, before you decide I'm someone worth knowing better." She told him about Eli. Not everything. There was no everything to tell, no act she needed to confess, only the quality of attention she had hoarded from another man, because her husband had never offered any, but enough. Enough that Nathaniel's face went through several things before settling on something she couldn't read. "And Dr. Reed," he said. "There's something there too. I could see it from across the room when his mother showed me out. There's nothing there. There could have been, perhaps, in another life. There isn't, in this one." "Why not?" The question surprised her into honesty sharper than she'd intended. "Because in this life, my husband just said the most honest thing he's said to me in 8 months, and I find I'd rather stay and see what happens next than go looking for honesty somewhere easier to find." What happened next was not simple, and Margaret would not have trusted it if it had been. It took weeks. Nathaniel was not a man who could unlearn 8 months of careful distance in a single breakfast conversation. And Margaret was not a woman who could unlearn a lifetime of being the daughter sent to clean up other people's messes, simply because someone had finally praised her for telling the truth. There were evenings of strained silence that hadn't fully burned off yet, old habits of politeness mistaken for peace. But there were also, increasingly, evenings where Nathaniel came home from the docks and sought her out in the parlor, instead of retreating to his study, and asked her, with what seemed like genuine and growing hunger, what she thought about things. The shipping contracts, the news from Halifax Council, the novel she was reading that he'd begun, almost shyly, to read alongside her so they'd have something to disagree about. She stopped arranging her afternoons around the ledger days. It wasn't a dramatic renunciation. She simply noticed, one Tuesday, that she hadn't thought about whether Eli was coming until he was already in the front hall, and that the quiet she felt in his company had been replaced, somewhere in the preceding month, by a different and more demanding quiet. The quiet of waiting to hear Nathaniel's step on the stairs each evening. When Eli came with the ledgers in the new year, she greeted him with the same warmth she always had, and felt nothing underneath it but ordinary kindness, and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes after a thing has already resolved itself, that what she'd wanted from him had never really been Eli at all. It had been the experience of being noticed. She had simply gone looking for it in the wrong house. Abigail, for her part, never apologized to Thomas Reed, married Samuel Whitfield in a small ceremony their mother called regrettably hasty, and seemed by every account perfectly content with the consequences she'd never had to face directly. Margaret found she no longer minded. Some old debt she'd been carrying on her sister's behalf, the debt of being the reliable one, the useful one, the one who cleaned, had been settled in some other currency entirely, in a sitting room that smelled of lavender, in a breakfast where her husband finally asked her who she was. In the spring, on the anniversary of a wedding that had begun as an arrangement between two families and very little else, Nathaniel found her on the back terrace overlooking the harbor, the ring, fitted properly now, resized a third time. This time for her specifically, catching the early light without her noticing it had stopped turning. "I used to think," he said, coming to stand beside her, "that affection grown later was a poor substitute for the kind that comes first. And now I think it's sturdier. It knows what it survived to get here." Margaret didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand, the way she had never once reached for it in 8 months of careful distance, and felt him close his fingers around hers like something he'd been waiting, without knowing it, for permission to do. The harbor moved below them, indifferent and constant, the way it had moved every spring before this one, and would move every spring after. And for the first time since the carriage ride that had begun all of it, Margaret felt no need to hold on to anything at all to keep herself steady. She simply stood there in a life she had not chosen, and had somehow slowly made her own, and let herself be still.